Welcome to Shooting Straight with Brad and David. I'm Brad Carlyon, your Navajo County Attorney.
I'm David Clouse, your Navajo County Sheriff.
And our guest this month is Elizabeth Ortiz, who's the Executive Director of the Arizona Prosecuting Attorneys Advisory Council. That's a mouthful. Elizabeth, instead of calling it all that, I call it APAC. But what is APAC?
So APAC was created by statute over 40 years ago, and our primary purpose is that we train prosecutors and those that work within prosecutors' offices. So that is what we focus on every day of the year.
When you say train, what do you mean by train?
So prosecutors, of course, need to be licensed attorneys in Arizona, and all licensed attorneys must complete a certain amount of continuing legal education credit each year, 15 hours each year, a minimum. So APAC provides that continuing legal education credit for the prosecutor, so they are in good standing with the state bar. We focus on topics that are directly relevant to prosecutors. It may be on DUI law. It may be on how to conduct a jury trial. How do you do an opening statement? How do you cross-examine a witness? We conduct trainings, hundreds and hundreds of hours of training all year long on a wide range of topics, because prosecutors, of course, have to handle and be prepared to handle a wide range of topics. But beyond that, we also prepare training and conduct training for those that work in prosecutor offices, perhaps a paralegal, a victim advocate, an administrative professional. So we try to take a very holistic approach. You know, as Navajo County Attorney, that every single person in that office, regardless of their position, is essential to fulfilling the mission of the county attorney's office or the municipal prosecutor's office or the attorney general's office. And so we strive to provide all of those individuals training so that they can do the very best in their jobs.
I think you just answered it, but who all do you provide the training to, and also who don't you provide training to?
So under the statute, we provide training specifically to the state, county, and city prosecutors in Arizona. So it'd be the Attorney General, those who work for the Attorney General's office, those who work in the 15 county attorney offices, and the municipal prosecutors in Arizona. Who notably does not fall under that umbrella are tribal prosecutors and federal prosecutors. That said, we have a very collaborative relationship with all prosecution agencies, and although and whenever possible, we try to coordinate training that also includes them. Furthermore, we take a collaborative approach and often do multidisciplinary trainings that include law enforcement, that include probation officers, that include perhaps service providers in domestic violence clinics. So we have our statutory charge, but once we fulfill that, we look for opportunities to be very collaborative.
I know that law school, at least when I went, it taught you how to think and not how to be an attorney. Does APAC help these new graduates who become prosecutors learn how to be an attorney?
Well, that is certainly part of our goal, because it's one thing to memorize a statute or memorize an evidentiary rule, and it's a much different thing to actually practice law. And there is not only the interpretations of laws, but there's that human element of it. How do you sit down with a victim and explain why you are or are not charging their case? How do you talk through and explain to a jury a case? How do you think through for yourself whether or not a particular case meets the legal standards for pursuing? So there's a lot more to being a lawyer, and in particular to being a prosecutor than what we learned in law school.
Do you provide teaching the skills to a recent graduate or recent new prosecutor as to how to do a trial from beginning to end or segments of it?
We do. We run what we call a Fundamentals of Trial Advocacy course twice a year. It is a week-long course where we teach them how to do everything from an opening statement to closing argument and everything in between. Direct examination, cross-examination, examination of expert witnesses. We teach them how to pick a jury. We teach them how to deal with perhaps witnesses that recant. In other words, that change their story once they get to court. All the things that we believe a prosecutor needs to have firsthand experience doing. For that particular course, we work with the community to bring in volunteer jurors, and we culminate the week-long course with a mock jury trial. And it is such an effective mechanism for teaching these new prosecutors, even though they know that it's not real, they know it's a mock trial. It is really nice to see how, whether it be their competitive streak or whether it be just the quest to be able to show their newly formed skills. But these mock trials that we do at the end of the week are always just really, they put their heart and soul into it.
So it sounds like if somebody's fresh out of law school, 3 years, right, they're going to still need some additional training done on court or trial procedures and stuff like that.
And it's not just those fresh out of law school. I had almost 3 years under my belt as a civil attorney for a large law firm, and I had never been in a courtroom. I wrote a lot of motions and argued motions, but I had no idea about opening statements, cross-examination, and I went through it and it was very informative.
So does any of your training involve police officers or deputy sheriffs in that courtroom?
Yeah, it does. So for that particular training, the fundamental trial advocacy, we use a fact pattern that involves both domestic violence charges and DUI charges, because we find that those not only are two very common types of cases that new prosecutors handle, but we believe that the skills necessary to handle those kind of cases can be applied. If you know how to cross-examine a defendant in a domestic violence, you can apply that to any other type of case. If you learn how to do a direct examination or a cross-examination of a criminalist in a DUI case, you can apply that to a homicide case or a child abuse case. So to that end, again, it's a very collaborative training in that we reach out to our community partners and we reach out to local law enforcement, and they come in and they shockingly play the role of the law enforcement when we do these. And similarly, we reach out to the crime lab and they send us criminalists to play the role of the criminalists. So we have law enforcement coming in, we have criminalists coming in, we have members of the greater community coming in to play the jurors. We have volunteers coming in to play the role of the victim and the witnesses and the defendant. So it's what we've heard is that, especially with the crime lab, they will often send us their new criminalists who perhaps are incredibly just knowledgeable regarding scientific analysis, but they've never testified in court and are a little bit nervous about it. So it's a nice opportunity for them to learn a little bit.
They'll learn how to talk in plain English.
Plain English, yeah, there you go.
Scientific.
And that's the same for a police officer or a sheriff's deputy, it being one of the key witnesses, right? Being the investigative part, you still get the jitters or you still get the unfamiliarity of a trial because you're not in it all the time and and you may know a case front and back, but the first time you, as a young officer, a young deputy, you're sitting there, you're like, it's intimidating. But I guess it comes with experience. I'm sure it's the same with your prosecutors as well.
You had talked about becoming more collaborative with other partners. What do you mean by that?
So, prosecutors, we do not handle cases in a vacuum. law enforcement investigate cases, send them to prosecutor offices to review, make charging decisions, and then either proceed or not proceed. We have victim advocates, some which work within prosecutor offices, but there's also victim advocates and victim service providers outside of prosecutor offices. And then there's probation officers, which, if a defendant is convicted and placed on probation, are involved with supervision, and many other individuals. And so when you look at a case in the criminal justice system, we all have our role, but if we view that as working in a silo, that's not to the benefit of the greater community. And if our goal is to do justice, and that's exactly what a prosecutor's goal is, the case law from the United States Supreme Court, decades-old case law, has made clear that a prosecutor is a minister of justice. It means that our job is to try to figure out what the right thing is, and do it. And to have that happen, prosecutors can't simply be working in a silo. They need to be communicating with these other criminal justice professionals, talking about how to improve the processes, improve investigations, perhaps, and just have that communication. Let me give you some examples. I spent many years working for the Maricopa County Attorney's Office, and a number of those years I worked solely as what we called a charging attorney. So my job day in and day out is I read police report after police report after police report, and I decided whether or not to file charges on these cases. A good portion of that time was spent communicating with the submitting officer, letting him or her know, I'm filing these charges or I'm not filing these charges. We don't have evidence here, or we have evidence, but unfortunately, I believe for legal reasons, it's not going to be admitted. And having that communication so that the investigating officer could then take that knowledge and apply it going forward. And so APAC kind of takes that to a greater scale, a more global scale, where we bring trainings together. And for example, we did a training recently on vulnerable adult abuse. And in that audience, it was a virtual training, but in that virtual audience, we had law enforcement and we had prosecutors and we had victim advocates. And they're learning side by side, virtually side by side, about, for example, trauma-informed interviewing and the impact, the neurobiology of trauma, and seeing how that can impact investigations and can impact how a victim advocate perhaps communicates with a victim and impact the prosecutor's job. And so when we share that information, although we all have our unique roles, it helps all of our roles, all of us do our roles better, and it helps us all have greater success in achieving justice.
I think that's a great point and great examples you used. As a young deputy or as a young officer, you draft police reports and you submit, you hit send, and it's where do they go from there, right? And until you start learning those processes and meeting the charging attorneys and meeting the trial attorneys, because when you get something declined and you feel, well, that was a really good case, why is it being declined? In your experience of being a trial or a charging attorney, what was some of the bigger deficiencies or bigger reasons you saw some cases not being declined?
Well, I think oftentimes I'd read the police report and I would see great potential for other evidence, but there wasn't that follow-up.
There you go.
The neighbor, perhaps, for example, it was a domestic violence call, and we know that the neighbor was the one that called it in, but the officer never then went next door and said, Mrs. Jones, so why did you call 911 and what did you see and what do you know? And we wouldn't see necessarily physical documentation, so a picture of where a fist had gone through the wall, or a broken picture frame, or pictures of bruises. So we would simply have, for example, a domestic violence victim's verbal statement, And while that's certainly very important evidence, when we have all of that supporting evidence, then it makes the case much, much stronger.
It's that verify part of it, right? Because I know it's going back to my experience, having that collaboration that you spoke of when I started meeting with the prosecutor and understanding their second question, their third question, fourth question, we as investigators start thinking of those and saying, well, if I was to present this case right now, I only have the first two questions answered. I don't have 3, 4, and 5. And then you start and you become a more polished investigator. And I think your cases become more presentable for the prosecution.
You look beyond, do I have probable cause to arrest, to do I have enough evidence to convict?
And that's what we're working on in our office with our young deputies. And I know it's just part of our training regimen is to ask those further questions and verifying a lot of that information, because young deputies say, well, she said this happened, he said he did it, what else do you need? But we all know you need more than that, right?
Especially when they recant.
Yeah.
Well, and I was having a conversation recently with a prosecutor colleague, and she focuses solely on family violence cases.
Yeah.
And she was very frustrated where she had reviewed a series of cases where she strongly suspected there had been a strangulation, yet the additional steps to document the strangulation medical evidence were not taken, and that is something that you can't go back in time.
No.
And so she was having a series of conversations with detectives who had submitted it, and she was very frustrated that the cases presented to her, she didn't have sufficient evidence to charge. In her gut, she believed that it happened, but there wasn't sufficient evidence, and so ethically she cannot charge those. And she was looking for ways to not have this repeat itself, and was reaching out to officers. And strangulation is another topic that we at APAC do extensive training on to talk to people.
And why is strangulation important?
Well, strangulation is important for a number of reasons. Obviously the potential for serious harm in and of itself with strangulation is very concerning. But what the evidence shows us that strangulation indicates and the potential for a future fatal event is just frightening. So in other words, what the research shows us, what the cases show us, is that if a person is willing and able to strangle another person, that the chance of a future encounter being fatal goes up astronomically. When you think about it, the nature of strangulation is such a personal one, where it's such a personal injury, as opposed to, certainly not to minimize any other type of injury, but a gunshot wound can be a very impersonal type of injury the way it's inflicted. But strangulation, you have that close proximity, you're actually skin on skin, and often you're looking somebody in the eye. And those factors just cause great concern.
It sounds like APAC does a lot of nuts and bolts type of training, but they also do some other, for lack of a better term, philosophical to make you think type of training. One of the ones that I've really appreciated over the years is a program called What You Do Matters. Can you explain what that is and why it's important?
Absolutely. So What You Do Matters, Lessons from the Holocaust, is a program that was developed by historians at the Holocaust Museum, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And the course was developed because a police officer had toured the museum, and he couldn't understand how, after touring the museum and seeing images of police officers on patrol in Nazi Germany, he couldn't reconcile, how did that happen? If what we now know happened in Nazi Germany, how did that happen if there were police officers doing their job? and he asked a lot of questions, and the historians have a lot of answers because of I think it's 230 tons of evidence that was collected after the war. And from that evidence, and from the start of this law enforcement officer's questions, this course was put together. Arizona, I'm really proud to say we are the only state that has found a way to bring this course outside of the museum in DC and to have a mobile version of it, if you would. We started it in 2012 in Yavapai County in Arizona. Yavapai County Attorney Sheila Polk was instrumental in bringing it to Arizona. It became so popular that in 2014 we expanded it statewide. And so we have APAC, and APAC joining forces with AZ Post, which oversees law enforcement training and certification. And we joined forces. We trained a number of people, law enforcement officers and prosecutors. So the training is, unlike any other training I've ever been through, and I know both of you have had the opportunity to attend the training. Typically, for example, if I were to teach on Miranda warnings, it would be a very here's the law, here's the case law, here are some things to memorize, and make sure you memorize these things so you know them in court. But What You Do Matters is not like that at all. It's a very personal journey. It is the takeaways we tell the people right up front. We say the takeaways are twofold. One is that we are all personally responsible for the choices we make. That all of us work in offices where there are policies and procedures and chains of command. The rationale of, well, my boss told me to do something, does not alleviate any of us from our personal responsibility. And the second takeaway for the course is that the role of law enforcement and prosecutors is so vitally important in our community and has such widespread impact in our community that every single one of our decisions can and does have impact, and it does matter, and that is why we have to be ever vigilant about making sure that we do not stray, and we keep focused on what is the right thing to do, what is the ethical decision in any particular case. So it is a course that uses history as a vehicle to take people on a very personal journey and to really examine for themselves, why did I choose to become a prosecutor? Why did I choose to become a law enforcement officer? And how, in the everyday world and everyday frustrations and challenges, how can I make sure that I never stray from the reason?
It doesn't sound like a lecture course. So how do you get engagement from those who are attending your course?
So the course itself utilizes images that and that we look at, and it's a series of images that depict incremental change in law enforcement about the 10 years prior to the start of World War II. So they start looking at images from the early 1930s, and the course culminates in the early 1940s when the Nazi regime decided it was time to implement the final solution, which of course was their code term for the systematic extermination of all European Jews and other targeted groups. So we have about a 10-year period, and we look at images selected by the historians at the museum, and we look at images that depict this incremental change in law enforcement. And what's interesting, and what I as a facilitator, because I have the honor of being a facilitator for the course, what I as a facilitator will remind those joining me in the journey is that the nature of what the police are doing doesn't change, but the purpose of what they're doing, there's a shift. And what I mean by that, and the example I typically give is, for example, the police suddenly weren't practicing medicine, or they weren't suddenly teaching kindergarten. They were still doing law enforcement type things. They were looking for people who were suspected for whatever reason. They were detaining people. They were using weapons. They were doing the types of activities. They were searching homes. They were doing the types of activities that law enforcement today still does. I mean, those are core parts of a law enforcement officer's job. But the purpose behind the searches, the purpose behind who they were detaining, the purpose behind why they were using their weapons shifted from being protectors of the people to enforcers of Nazi ideology.
What kind of feedback do you get from the people who have participated, and about how many people do you think have gone through What You Do Matters?
You know, we didn't keep detailed attendance records in the early years, and so I can't give you a precise number, but I had this conversation recently with someone, and we feel very confident in saying thousands of people in Arizona, thousands of law enforcement officers and prosecutors have attended this in Arizona. But word of it, although we are the only state that has it, word of this program has spread across the United States. And we, myself and other facilitators, we have traveled, oh my goodness, we've traveled to so many states and put this course on for their law enforcement and their prosecutors. One of the most meaningful of those travel experiences was in early February. We were invited to go to Minnesota to train their National Guard. And the National Guard was the military police of the National Guard, and they were about to be deployed. And they wanted this training to be the very last thing that they had. So we flew up and we did a marathon weekend where we trained group after group. And it was so impactful to me to be able to have that opportunity to train these men and women as they were about to be deployed.
And unfortunately, we've run out of time. Thank you for joining us, Elizabeth, and thank you for joining us for this month's Shooting Straight with Brad and David. And please stay tuned for this month's Most Wanted.
Nicolette Marie Tutkin, 19, has a valid and confirmed felony warrant for narcotic drug possession and use and taking the identity of another to gain profit. Nicolette's last known address was in Sholo. Matthew Dare, 21, has a valid and confirmed felony warrant for narcotic drug possession and use and drug paraphernalia possession and use. Matthew's last known address was in Sholo as well. If you have any information on the whereabouts of Matthew or Nicolette, please call the Navajo County Communications Center at 928-524-4050. Or to remain anonymous, please call WeTip at 1-800-78-CRIME.